you get a notification.
Yeah, I think. Okay, so welcome everyone. Today is our 5th day and final day of our winter workshop. So Philsa India is so happy that things went well so far. And today we are going to end with a bang, as Tarun has just said. We have Professor Jacob Stegenga. He teaches at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at University of Cambridge. Morning, we have had the influence of values in science, and we have discussed how values influence science a lot. And most probably, Stegenga will be defending a very interesting picture of science where the talk is titled as Sisyphean Science, Why Value Freedom is Worth Pursuing. So over to you, Jacob.
Thanks very much. So can I just double check that you can hear me and see the slides okay?
Yeah, very well.
Great. Okay, so in some philosophical and religious traditions, there's an ideal which is articulated, and sometimes the ideal is articulated in quite bleak terms. So for example, here's a sermon from Buddha, who writes, when life is coming to an end, birth is exhausted, the holy life has been lived out, what can be done is done, of this there is no more beyond. Now, sometimes this putative ideal state is described in terms of a complete detachment of one's self. So a complete elimination of all desires, of all evaluations of the world as good. And that has struck some commentators as paradoxical because it's a bit odd to think of a desire-free state as itself desirable, or a state in which an agent has eliminated one's self, where agents are normally thought to be the evaluators of good or bad. So if one's self is eliminated, how can there be good or bad? How can the state itself be good or bad? Recently, Adamson and Guarneri have offered a resolution to this putative puzzle. They've argued that, given how bleak these kinds of ideal states are described, maybe these states are, quote, not really intended as descriptions of the good for human beings, but rather we should instead ask, how does the idea of striving to achieve such a state help one make progress? What's interesting about this is Adamson and Guarneri are decoupling the pursuit desirability of some state from the end state desirability of that state. So in other words, some condition, some state can be pursuit desirable. It can be a good thing to pursue that state, but not be end state desirable. So what we do in this talk, and this is a co-authored paper with Tarun Menon, I should have said that at the start, is we apply this strategy of decoupling pursuit desirability from end state desirability to another philosophical context. And that is the literature on the value-free ideal. So I understand that some or most of you have had a morning workshop in which you were learning about the literature on the value-free ideal. So our target in this paper is to apply that decoupling strategy, decoupling pursuit desirability from end state desirability, to offer a new version of the value-free ideal for science. So here's the structure of the talk. In the first part, I'll just describe what the value-free ideal is and describe in brief the key arguments in favor of the value-free ideal and the main arguments that have been promoted to challenge the value-free ideal. Then in this first part of the talk, we will briefly articulate our version of the value-free ideal and then argue that pursuing that value-free ideal is feasible or possible. And the last part of the talk, we argue that pursuit of that value-free ideal is a good thing. The sort of short take-home punchline from the talk, the main thesis, is that scientists ought to act as if science should be value-free. That's the version of the value-free ideal that we're defending. Okay, so first, the value-free ideal. Just to lay some preliminaries, it's uncontroversial that values influence science in several key ways. So of course, values help determine the scientific research agenda. So science, values can influence whether or not scientists pursue the development of, new material technologies for bridges, or if scientists pursue building a bigger bomb, for example. And of course, values influence constraints on scientific reasoning. So, for example, ethical constraints on medical trials. And of course, values influence the application of scientific work to technological developments. So none of that is very controversial. It's widely recognized that values influence science in those various ways. What is controversial is whether or not values influence scientific reasoning itself. Another bit of groundwork. So this is a pictorial depiction of an Earth-centered model of the solar system. This was, famously the Ptolemaic model of the solar system before Copernicus. And as more and more observations of the night sky came in over the centuries, to accommodate the various kinds of phenomena that were being observed in the stars, the Ptolemaic Earth-centered model of the solar system had to become more and more complicated. And in contrast, the Copernican sun-centered model was thought to be simpler. So it's uncontroversial too that some kinds of values are relevant to the truth of whether or not some hypothesis or theory is the case. So simplicity is one famous one. So we're just going to call those kinds of values epistemic values. And we're going to take it as uncontroversial that epistemic values are indeed relevant to scientific reasoning. So the controversial question is, do or ought non-epistemic values influence scientific reasoning? So here's a first pass at the value-free ideal. The value-free ideal holds that non-epistemic values should not influence the internal features of scientific reasoning. Okay. So there's been some very basic arguments that have been put forward in favor of this version of the value-free ideal. So here's Stalin greeting the agricultural scientist Lysenko. So famously, Lysenko was critical of Mendelian genetics, in part because he thought that his version of genetics was closer to Soviet principles. And so as a result, Soviet agriculture and Soviet biology was heavily influenced by Lysenkoan type principles, which itself were political, and that led to disaster in agricultural science and in agricultural production. So the idea here is we don't want non-epistemic values or ethical or moral or political values to influence the internal features of scientific work, because we could end up with science as done by Lysenko. It's not truth conducive. That's the short version of that worry. We also want the kind of science which is done in the spirit of advising policymakers to be free of idiosyncratic biases. So if the value-free ideal doesn't hold, if the internal workings of science are influenced by non-epistemic values, and then if that science is then used to advise policymaking, then the worry is that our resulting policies will be influenced by a non-representative set of values. Arguably, that's been the case with COVID modeling, for instance. The third kind of major argument in favor of the value-free ideal is that if the public thinks that scientific work, that the internal features of scientific reasoning are influenced by non-epistemic values, then the public will come to trust less that scientific work. So promoting the value-free ideal, and in fact satisfying the value-free ideal, can serve to promote trust in science. So in short, this is all kind of groundwork, and we'll see that these arguments are controversial, but on the surface, the view goes that value-free science is more truth-conducive, more democratic, and trust-enhancing. Okay. There have been a couple of key challenges to the value-free ideal. We're going to call these the framing problem and the methodological critique. So first, the framing problem. The framing problem goes like this. A lot of scientific projects involve concepts that themselves are laden with values, and the way that those concepts get operationalized or measured can inherit that value ladenness, and then the resulting conclusions are value laden. So for example, suppose we want to do some study that involves appealing to the notion of poverty. We could, for example, be comparing poverty rates between two different countries, or we could be comparing poverty rates before and after some particular policy intervention. Depending on our actual results will depend on the notion of poverty that we employ. So for example, we could employ an absolute notion of poverty, like the proportion of people who aren't able to afford a particular bundle of goods, or we could employ a relative measure of poverty, like the proportion of people below, say, the 50th percentile of mean income. And the resulting conclusions that we draw will depend on whether or not we choose the absolute or relative measure. And the choice between those measures is value laden. I mean, ask yourself, which is worse? Which is a worse condition to be in? Not being able to afford this particular bundle of goods, or being below, say, the 30th percentile of mean income in a country? There's no value neutral way to answer that sort of question. And so the science that uses notions like this will be value laden. That's the framing problem. The methodological critique goes like this. Here's a picture of a chemical dioxin, which is the case study in this very famous article by Heather Douglas published in the year 2000. The methodological critique basically says science is always uncertain. There are a variety of ways in which scientific work can go wrong. And when errors are made, those errors can have practical consequences, and our evaluation of those consequences can influence the particular methodological choices we make in doing science itself. So for example, in this article by Heather Douglas, with this example of dioxin, the question was, do dioxins cause cancer? And so scientists used, they dosed some rodents with this dioxin chemical at different concentrations, and then just dissected the animals and had a look to see if the tissues displayed evidence of toxicity. Douglas argues that at every stage of that scientific work, at the stage of characterizing the tissue samples, at the choice of statistical significance level, the choice of model for toxicity, all of these different choices, there's a possibility of erroneously concluding that the chemical causes cancer when it doesn't, or erroneously concluding that the chemical doesn't cause cancer when it does. Now, if you erroneously conclude that the chemical causes cancer when it doesn't, that could lead to policies which overregulate industries that use the chemical. On the other hand, if you erroneously conclude that the chemical doesn't cause cancer when it does, then you'll be under-regulating, and that will lead to harms to people. And so what is the extent to which we worry more about harms to people compared to over-regulating industry? Well, that is a non-epistemic evaluation. It's a set of non-epistemic concerns, and that can influence the various stages of scientific reasoning. That's the methodological critique. Okay, so we take those two critiques to be the main challenges to the value-free ideal. Now, to put them in our terms, these are clearly challenges to the end-state feasibility of the value-free ideal. We take it as a matter of fact that a lot of scientific work will involve using concepts like poverty, or will involve methods that are liable and prone to error. And so the framing problem and the methodological critique apply. Now, these challenges have also been taken as challenges to the end state desirability of the ideal. These arguments have been articulated as concluding that we ought not aim for a science which is value-free. One way that goes is, like, insofar as it's inevitable that non-epistemic values are going to be influencing scientific reasoning, instead of trying to eliminate the values, we should try to expose them and indeed try to enhance the range of values that are under consideration. This is a famous example in feminist science. It's the example of the study of primates or primatology. So here the story goes that the study of primate behavior until about 1960s or 1970s was dominated by males, and males brought a particular set of biases and assumptions to studying the behavior of primates and to theorizing about the behavior of primates. And that led to a particular view about primates. And then with the influx of a more diverse range of practitioners in primatology, that exposed the existing biases and led to better kind of primatology that got us closer to the truth about primate behavior. Okay, so the lesson of this primate story is sometimes articulated as follows: rather than try to eliminate values from science, we should try to enhance the range of perspectives and the corresponding range of values that are involved in some domain of scientific work. We're going to come back to this argument a little bit later. Okay, so we have a couple of key arguments in favor of the value-free ideal, a couple of key arguments challenging the value-free ideal. Before going further, it's worth noting that there are various ways in which a value-free ideal can be stated. So here's like one basic version. This thesis would hold that science is value-free. But we take the key challenges to the value-free ideal to show that this thesis is a non-starter. So there's a number of case studies in the values and science literature that conclusively show that science indeed is not value-free. Therefore, this version is a non-starter. But one might hold a kind of idealized version of this thesis, which holds that science should act as if science is value-free. The problem with this version of the value-free ideal is that it's basically telling scientists to pretend. It involves a claim that although science is value-laden, scientists should act as if science isn't value-laden, and that's a kind of pretense. And the critics of the value-free ideal have persuasively argued that if indeed science is value-laden, we shouldn't be pretending that it's not. We should be at least transparent about the role of values in scientific work, and this version of the value-free ideal denies that. So this version is probably a non-starter as well. Okay, here's another version. Science should be value-free. Now, we are going to discuss an argument that directly challenges this version of the value-free ideal. We haven't mentioned it yet, although there is a case to be made that this version of the value-free ideal could be rendered end-state feasible, but at the expense of being end-state desirable. But we're going to get there in just a moment. But what we want to argue is that we could grant all of the existing challenges to the value-free ideal as challenging these three versions of the value-free ideal, but nevertheless, those arguments don't touch this fourth version, our version, which says scientists should act as if science should be value-free. So that's the version of the value-free ideal that we're going to defend. Okay, one more bit of terminology. So we use this term bifurcation points. A bifurcation point is a place in the chain of scientific reasoning where different value perspectives will lead to contradictory conclusions. So suppose that we've got some fixed bit of evidence E, and according to one value set, that E and V1 warrants some conclusion C1, and that same bit of evidence, but with a different value set, warrants some different conclusion C2. And if C1 and C2 are inconsistent with each other, then there's a bifurcation point between those choice of value sets. And so one way to articulate our version of the value-free ideal is that scientists ought to be aiming at the elimination of bifurcation points. Okay, so that's our version of the value-free ideal. Now we want to argue that pursuing that version of the value-free ideal is feasible. And indeed, this is it's probably a routine. I think it's plausible to say that this is a routine aspect of scientific work, pursuing this version of the value-free ideal. So part of what motivates the values in science literature is recognizing that a lot of science is extremely complicated, and there are many points at which methodology and theorizing can go awry. And at those points, methods can be tuned in one way or another way. And those choices, like do you turn the dial to 7 or 9? Do you set your statistical significance level at X or Y? Those choices open the door for the influence of values on the scientific process. So that's the basic foundation for the methodological critique, for instance. And what we want to argue is that good scientific work can help to eliminate or at least modify the influence of those error points. Okay, so we're going to discuss a few strategies that scientific work can employ to do that, to eliminate bifurcation points. So the strategies that we're going to discuss are, we're calling bias reduction, bias neutralization, evidence strengthening, and hedging and deferral. Okay, so evidence strengthening, this is sort of simple. I'm just going to give the example, give the idea with an example. So suppose there's some observational study which is done, which observes a correlation between property A and property B. There's just an A-B association, an A-B correlation. That correlation could be a result of 3 possible causal relations. It could be that A causes B, that's the first line there. It could be B causes A, or it could be that C causes A and B. So those are 3 possibilities. Now suppose for whatever reason, I favor the A causes B theory. Like maybe I'm a scientist who works for a pharmaceutical company, and A is, some drug, and B is a patient getting healthy. So I favor the A causes B association, but Tarun favors the B causes A association. Well, at this stage of the scientific work, both of those hypotheses are permissible, and so we have a bifurcation point. But of course, what we can do is a better designed study to try to determine causality. So for example, we can do a randomized control trial. So we take a population and we randomly allocate some of the subjects to the intervention group where we give them some of the A. We randomly allocate some of the subjects to the control group where we give them some placebo. And we just look to see if there are more Bs happening in the group which we gave A to. And if there are, then we're entitled to, we have more justification for the A causes B conclusion. So this is the evidence strengthening strategy. Now, there are a whole variety of ways in which scientists routinely go about trying to strengthen evidence. They can gather more evidence, they can do better studies, like in this example. And the important thing to note is, at a certain point, if more evidence comes in or stronger evidence comes in, then one of the possible explanations here, like A causes B explanation, for example, is going to become so well justified that even if one were inclined to be believing the B causes A association because of your background values, you'll end up being persuaded by the A causes B association, and then there's a elimination of the bifurcation point. Okay, here's another way in which bifurcation points can be eliminated. So I've already mentioned this example of primatology. So with this influx of different kinds of perspectives, the existing biases were noticed and articulated, and that led to an improvement in methodology and in theorizing. So in an article about this kind of argument, Anke Buter asks this question: given the existence of values in scientific work, should we be aiming at purity or pluralism? Should we be aiming at trying to eliminate values or enriching the value set by being pluralistic, by incorporating a whole range of perspectives? And our view here is that this is a false dichotomy. So our view is that we can achieve purity by pluralism. And that's exactly what these examples show. So the example of feminist primatology in 1970 shows that with the incorporation of a diverse set of perspectives, like pluralism, the existing biases were exposed and methodology and theorizing was improved. So it was a step towards purity. So we're calling this bias neutralization. So the existing biases in some scientific domain can be neutralized via the incorporation of diverse perspectives. And that can lead to an elimination of bifurcation points via an improvement in methodology and theorizing. Okay, here's another strategy we're calling hedging and deferral. So deferral basically involves scientists not deciding on some fact of the matter, but just reporting the evidence about some hypothesis to policymakers and letting policymakers decide. Hedging involves weakening the strength of one's conclusion to the point that the evidence more strongly justifies that conclusion. So take deferral, for example. A scientist could conclude this drug should be approved for clinical use. That's one. Or a scientist could report two, this drug has a positive benefit harm profile, without speaking about approval, for instance. So that's deferring decision to policymakers. Or take hedging, for instance, in point 3 here, this drug reduces the risk of heart attacks by 35%. That's a kind of specific claim. This drug reduces the risk of heart attacks. That's a slightly more hedged claim. Or more hedged still, point 5. Based on the evidence, this drug probably reduces the risk of heart attacks. So the strength of the conclusion is being significantly weakened as we go down. So notice that we could have two scientists with two different value sets who disagree about point 3, for instance, but as we hedge, they end up coming to agree on, say, point 5. So hedging and deferral can work together as well, of course, because if one hedges, one might end up also deferring. Okay, so hedging and deferral both involve, or can involve, the elimination of bifurcation points. Now, hedging and deferral and the other strategies come with costs, and we will mention that in just a moment. We'll mention that right here. So the conclusion of these considerations is that science can eliminate bifurcation points. That's a routine aspect of scientific work. But what we want to note is that one significant cost of some of those strategies is that they can minimize the extent to which the scientific work can guide policymakers. And we take policy guidance to be a goal of a lot of scientific work. So take the hedging and deferral strategy. It could be the case that, like, for some policy purposes, policymakers need a relatively precise conclusion from scientists. And if the conclusion that's offered by scientists is too hedged, then the policymakers won't know what to do. They won't know what policies to enact. And so that's a significant cost. So we take that cost, that feature of action guidance, policy guidance, to be an operative constraint on at least some scientific work. Okay, so we've argued here that our version of the value-free ideal is pursuit feasible. What we want to argue now is that it's also pursuit desirable. Right, so we've been mentioning some of the costs of eliminating bifurcation points. So for example, minimizing the extent to which some scientific work can guide policymakers' action guidance. The evidence strengthening strategy could come along with financial costs, for instance, or it could come along with also action guiding constraints. For instance, there might be some observational study that suggests that some chemical causes some harmful effects. And one response to that would be to say, okay, increase the strength of evidence. But if you set about trying to increase the strength of evidence, you might have to wait, say, 5 or 10 years to get the study done. Or it might be that there are just ethical constraints on how good the methodology can be, because we can't like willingly administer some putative, harmful chemical to research subjects. So there are like ethical constraints, financial constraints, policy guiding constraints to the strategies that can be employed to eliminate bifurcation points. So we're conceiving of these as constraints on science. So scientific work, and especially this policy-oriented scientific work, should be working to satisfy these constraints while also trying to eliminate bifurcation points. Okay, here's another bit of terminology. So this minimal value set, I'm going to call M, which is the state of a science in which there's the least influence of bifurcation points while satisfying those constraints we just discussed: action guidance, ethical, financial constraints. So that's the minimal value set. It doesn't mean the complete elimination of bifurcation points, because we've already noted that some scientific work might have to involve appeal to some non-epistemic values in order to satisfy those operative constraints. Okay, complete value freedom, we're calling VF, which is just no influence of bifurcation points. So while the side constraints aren't satisfied, they're not satisfied because in real policy-oriented scientific work, some of these satisfying those side constraints requires the influence of some non-epistemic values. Okay, so we've got this one state M and this other state VF. The question is, which of these states should science be aiming at, M or VF? We're going to argue that it should be aiming for VF, even though M is the condition under which, by stipulation, it's the condition under which there's the least influence of bifurcation points while satisfying all the side constraints. Here's an analogy. Suppose we have this really cluttered room, and we want to tidy the room up. One way to tidy the room up would be to just eliminate everything in the room. But suppose we're operating under some principles of interior design, like we want the room to be comfortable and livable. Then ending at that middle picture it's not okay. It's not a satisfactory end point for this room tidying exercise. Instead, we should be aiming at some tidy room while still satisfying some basic principles of interior. There's a place to sit, there's some warmth, and there's a plant. It's not too cluttered, but there's just enough stuff in the room to make it livable and pleasant. So if you were at this first stage and you were told to declutter the room, if you went all the way to the middle stage with completely empty room, you wouldn't have done your job well enough. You would have gone too far. Instead, you should be aiming at that third stage. So now consider the states of value freedom or the minimal value set. The analogy here is that the minimal value set is like the picture on the bottom. It's this the minimal degree of room clutter while satisfying basic constraints on interior design, like having a place to sit, for example. Whereas the room in the middle here is a state of complete value freedom. And when it comes to interior design, that state has gone too far. So should we be aiming at, when it comes to science, should we be aiming at M or VF? Should we be aiming at this minimal value set, or should we be aiming at the elimination of all bifurcation points, all values? We've already stipulated that arriving at M is desirable. And we know that pursuing value freedom will lead us to M. And value freedom is thought by some of the critics of the value-free ideal to be undesirable for some of the reasons we've already noted. A state of complete value freedom can be less action guiding, for example. So we could just aim for M rather than aim for VF. Yet we want to argue we should be aiming for VF. Here's why. Aiming for M is not action guiding for scientists. That's in part because we don't really know what M looks like. We don't know what that state, that minimal value state looks like in advance, without having first done a bunch of the scientific work, without kind of waiting to see what sorts of developments in methodology will occur. In part, that's because developments in science can change the actual constitution of M. So as methodologists develop more and more sophisticated methods, as technologies develop, the ability to minimize the influence of biases and values in science changes. And so the actual constitution of M changes over time. Moreover, aiming for M has all the drawbacks of value-laden science. So if we were to be promoting a science that said we're aiming at this state of minimal value freedom, that involves aiming at a state of some value-latedness, and that could have the drawback, for example, of minimizing the extent to which public trusts science, because indeed, we would be saying science should be aiming at some degree of value-latedness. Okay, on the other hand, aiming for value freedom is action guiding for science because it's got quite a simple message. It says science should be aiming to eliminate as many bifurcation points as possible while still satisfying the side constraints. So we know what that looks like. And moreover, aiming for value freedom is not sensitive to these technological changes or methodological changes in science. And finally, aiming for value freedom has the benefits of the value-free ideal. So if we say, like, we're promoting a science in which scientists actively try to eliminate bifurcation points, scientists actively try to eliminate the influence of values on science, that, to go back to the trust example, that can be trust enhancing. So aiming for value freedom has the benefits of value freedom itself. Okay, so here's an analogy. Suppose you're wandering around lost in the desert and you really need water, you're dying of thirst. And you meet some person in this area who knows the area well. And that person says, right in front of that rock in the distance, the rock with the two spikes, right in front of that rock, there's a well with clean drinking water. So aim for that rock. I can't really tell you how to get there because there's no clear road. There's no clear set of paths. I can't say turn left here and then turn right there. You'll just get lost if you do that. Instead, just aim for that rock with the two spikes on it. But on that rock, you don't want to get on top of that rock. First of all, it's impossible because there's this big chasm in front of the rock. But even if it were possible, the rock is filled with dangerous animals and all these cliffs that you can fall off of. It's a very dangerous place to be on top of that rock. But right before you get to that rock and right before the chasm in front of the rock, that's where the well is. So you say to yourself, right, you are actively aiming to walk towards the rock with the two peaks on it there, but and you will indeed stop when you get to the well. But in finding your way through this desert landscape, you're actively walking towards, you're actively aiming towards the distant rock with the two spikes on it. So that's an analogy that we take to motivate our view of the value-free ideal. Although ending at a state of complete value freedom might be undesirable for some of the reasons that the critics have noted that we've discussed, actively aiming to pursue the value-free ideal can be a good thing. Okay, I've already mentioned this example, so I'll just skip over this. Okay, so we've been arguing that science should aim at value freedom. Now, there is one puzzle that's worth noting here, which is that if value freedom is indeed undesirable, as many of the critics of the value-free ideal have argued it is, then pursuing value freedom can be desirable only if pursuit desirability is decoupled from end-state desirability. Because remember, the critics of value freedom have been criticizing end-state desirability of value freedom. So if we're saying pursue value freedom, pursuit can be desirable only if pursuit desirability can in general be decoupled from end-state desirability. And that's where our hero, the Buddhist monk, comes in, because we took this example at the start to illustrate that possibility of decoupling pursuit desirability from end-state desirability. Okay, so that leads us to conclude by articulating this new version of the value-free ideal, which holds that scientists should act as if science should be value-free. And that's the end. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That was quite wonderful. And I'm sure that most of our workshop participants will have something to agree as well as something to disagree. So I open the session for discussions. Please use the raise hand option so I can call you one by one. Okay, Tushar.
Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, so, I'd like to come at that point where, labeled purity or pluralism as false dichotomy. So, I think it can be only labeled as false dichotomy if we presume that values are uniformly distributed. So, but what I think that values carry different force. So in your account, say if E and V1 leads to C1, E and V2 leads to C2. And if I say that different values carry different force, so there might have been some systemic reasons because of which some values have been eliminated altogether and have not been even taken into account. And we don't really know what values have been eliminated. So, this false dichotomous account is presuppose that values are uniform in their force.
Yeah, I think I understand the question, and it's important. So, right. I mean, this example of primatology, for example, precisely shows, I think, that the distribution of values isn't uniform, especially across time, right? So there was some time at which primatology had a pretty. This is the story from feminist philosophy of science, at least, is that the distribution of values was kind of homogeneous, and with the kind of gradual influx of diverse practitioners, it became more and more diverse. But if that narrative is to be believed, then your point is exactly right, namely the distribution of values can be it's not necessarily uniform, and so that can, I think if I understand the spirit of your question, I think that can lead to some interesting challenges. So, for instance, if there's not a uniform distribution of values, then there's a worry that existing values could just maintain their sort of dominant force on a science. Yeah, and that's one of the, that's a kind of lesson that I take from the examples that feminist philosophers have offered us, namely, So having a diverse set of practitioners can help. One of the arguments that Longino gives is that there also has to be this kind of slightly level playing field. It doesn't have to be a totally level playing field, but there has to be some degree of scientific authority which is shared in a community. There has to be like, modes of criticism or venues for criticism to occur, and then there has to be uptake of criticism, these kinds of Longino type criteria. And it wouldn't be enough, for example, to just have like a few diverse practitioners or a few people with like different value sets, and not have that other kind of structure in place to allow those different value sets to engage in effective critique.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Anatoly, please.
Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. I don't have a very well-formed question, but I still will try to ask something on the lines of, in your view, how easy it is to dissociate values from motivation? Because I can imagine that, for example, lots of medical scientists would go to do their research because they were somehow, I don't know, for example, affected by the environment, having someone in the environment being sick of certain disease, and that would, for example, motivate them to go and to study that problem. And in this case, it looks to me that they would be motivated by certain values, a certain, I don't know, sense of compassion or impression that they received from the environment. And so in this case, first of all, I don't see it as a bad thing to have that type of values with you on board in the research. And second, I don't see how, coming back to the beginning, I see that, for example, it would be difficult to dissociate certain values from motivations. And what would be your take on it?
Yeah. Thank you for that. Right, I completely agree that values can motivate particular kinds of research programs, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a good thing, right? So, and in fact, if anything, we ought to hope that those values indeed are representative of a kind of broad range of perspectives. So the choice of research program is clearly value laden. There's nothing controversial about that. What is controversial is and this is not something that we discuss in this paper, but it pertains to your question, is how should those values that motivate particular research programs get organized? So the status quo right now is something like some degree of liberalism with a bit of government research agenda setting, and where the research agenda might be broadly construed, representative of democratic will in some super indirect way. And what some critics say is that ends up leading to a situation in which the scientific research agenda is not being determined by a very representative set of values. And so there needs to be some kind of change in the way values influence research agenda. So one option on offer is this notion of well-ordered science from Philip Kitcher. So I agree with that part of your question, but the influence of values on like the kind of motivational issue about like a scientist being motivated to pursue this kind of research project or that kind of research project, it's not very mysterious or puzzling that there would be such an influence of values on choice of research program. Our worry in this paper is addressing these arguments against the value-free ideal, where the concern is about the influence of values directly in the internal stages of scientific reasoning itself. Does that address your question?
But would that be easier? I mean, not easier, but would it be somehow more understandable to sort of define it, to bring in the outdated distinction between discovery and justification or something like this? So you would say you would like to have your justification practices value-free, whereas discovery can be a little bit less constrained in that sense. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, I'm a pretty old-fashioned philosopher, and I think maybe my co-author Tarun is even more old-fashioned than me. So I'm a kind of like neo-positivist in this sense. Like I'm not so allergic to this distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. Although I think a lot of this work in the literature that challenges the value-free ideal shows just how kind of complicated the interaction is between contexts of justification and contexts of discovery. For example, like to take the example of evidence strengthening from my talk, the question is, in the context of justification, the A causes B theory was just as justified as the B causes A theory, when all we had was the observational study. Now, to break that tie, so to speak, to eliminate the bifurcation point, that motivates the change to methodology, which is supposed to be the context of discovery, right? So that motivates a change in methodology, like do a randomized trial rather than this observational study. And so there can be, this complicated back and forth between the context of discovery and the context of justification. Nevertheless, I think it is more than just useful. I think it's kind of conceptually solid to say that once you've got this evidence, it's a reasonable question to ask, what's the extent to which this evidence supports this hypothesis or that hypothesis? And that is at a particular stage of scientific inquiry, which is independent of, and not independent causally or independent temporally, but just independent conceptually from what happens in this discovery stage.
Maybe if I can do just a very, very small question after that. Maybe very briefly, what's your opinion on aesthetic values in science? And would you place them in the same category, something that should be sort of avoided, or it's something third, independent of more socially oriented values?
Yeah,
and therefore more permissible.
Yeah. I mean, here I think it depends. So again, if we're speaking just about justification, so we're just speaking about this kind of internal stage of scientific reasoning, then the question just would be, is the value at stake truth conducive or not? And, there's, to take simplicity, for example, some people say, yes, simplicity is an aesthetic quality, but it's not merely an aesthetic quality. And there's like a long technical literature that shows that under particular conditions, a simpler hypothesis is indeed more truth conducive than a complex hypothesis. And so there's a truth relevance to this aesthetic quality, right? But then take like beauty, for example. Like some people say, oh, like this model of string theory is more beautiful than that model. But if it's merely like this like assertion of elegance without some kind of background set of principles that link that appeal to elegance to truth conduciveness, then I personally would be unpersuaded. Yeah. Thanks for your questions.
Thanks, Anatoly. And Wasim?
Yeah, hello, Professor. Thank you so much for the talk. My question is related to the question that Tushar raised about false dichotomy that you said exists between purity and pluralism, right? So you said that pluralism in fact leads to purity, and it is feasible to strive for that goal or ideal. But the number of let's say the perspectives that exist out there is indefinite, or one can, I mean, it can be even infinite. The number of perspectives left within the pluralism. So how is it feasible to, or is it possible to incorporate all the perspectives if they let's say exist in infinite numbers? How is it feasible to incorporate all of them? I don't think it will be ever be possible. So
Yeah, good question. And not only, I mean, part of your question is there are so many, potentially an infinite number of perspectives, so it wouldn't be feasible. But I think you could push this question even further and say, I mean, there are some perspectives which are either, ethically pernicious or completely not truth conducive, right? And so plausibly, those perspectives shouldn't be included in this pluralism as a means to purity consideration. I'm pretty sympathetic to that line. So this is a tricky question because, I mean, on the one hand, we might think that some kinds of perspectives, some value sets could be blocked on prior ethical grounds. So we could just say, like, we're just not going to entertain value sets that we have good, well-justified reasons to think are immoral or pernicious. Like, we're not going to admit like racist values or sexist values into our theorizing in the social sciences, for instance. But in some sense, that's a kind of glib answer, because plausibly, in real cases, things are a lot more complicated, and the range of perspectives aren't as, so clearly articulated as like, well, over here I'm the sexist scientist, and over here I'm the racist scientist. But instead, things are quite a bit more complicated. I mean, take, for example, debates about vaccine hesitancy during the COVID pandemic. And so who should get invited to the table, so to speak? Like, what sets of values or what sets of perspectives should be included in this pluralism as a means to purity strategy? That's just a hard question. It's a hard question for this brand of feminist philosophy of science, sensu longino, which holds that we should be enriching value sets. Now, that's all hard. One nice thing about our position is that we have an answer to all of those difficulties. The answer is basically like this. If the inclusion of some particular perspective or some particular value set is in fact not contributing to the elimination of bifurcation points, if it's in fact, say, enhancing the number of bifurcation points, then it's no go. So we have an answer to that. That's something that I find appealing about the position. So if it's, to go back to the kind of sexist science or racist scientist, if we can just make a case that the inclusion of that perspective is going to be increasing bifurcation points rather than decreasing bifurcation points, then it's just not to be included in this pluralism as a means to purity strategy. Thank you for the question.
All right. Thank you, Wasim. Siddharth?
Yes, thank you for the talk, Professor. So my question was, do we have to shift our preferences when we go from slow science towards fast science? So during pandemics as such, do we still maintain that preference to go towards value neutral, uh, value free ideal? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, another good question. So the questioner is appealing to this notion of slow science versus fast science, where slow science is sort of like standard science without extreme temporal pressures that might be motivated by emergencies like the current pandemic. Whereas fast science, this is like a notion that I used in a blog post. Fast science is the kind of science that we see where things are extremely rapid, studying some cause of an emergency like the coronavirus, and the way that science is done is very the methods are deployed very rapidly, and the results are promoted very rapidly, sometimes by circumventing peer review and so on. And the question is, how does, if I understood the question properly, the question is how does fastness intersect with the question about values in science? And it's an important one because these contexts of fast science, like some of the pandemic science, are indeed motivated by trying to minimize the harm that's caused by some emergency. And so to use one of the examples in the paper, to minimize bifurcation points, like evidence strengthening, right? So we wouldn't want to just demand that we need more and more and more evidence for the safety of some vaccine, for example, while millions of people are liable to die unless they get the vaccine. And so in some contexts, the action guiding desideratum is going to block the ability to deploy those strategies to eliminate bifurcation points. And yeah, that's just a constraint that some science has to work under. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. So, all right, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, there is a question in our YouTube chat by Vipul Vivek. I will read it out. Could pursuing an end state we do not desire itself lead to misplaced priorities? I'm thinking of economists arguing for free market models as being idealizations, hard to achieve but still worth pursuing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in general, the question is worth worrying about. So of course, if there's some state which is end state undesirable, then the pursuit of that end state indeed might lead to a corrupted set of priorities. I think that that's in general worthy of concern. And so then to apply it to this talk, the worry would be, would the end state undesirability of the value-free ideal, would pursuing that lead to a corrupted set of priorities? And I think at least in the context of scientific work, no. For some of the reasons that I gave towards the end of the talk. So as long as what we called the constraints on scientific work, like ethical constraints, financial constraints, and principally policy guidance, as long as those were being satisfied, so yeah, as long as those were being satisfied, then pursuing value freedom, I don't think would lead to a perverse set of goals or corrupted set of goals. The worry would be if pursuit of value freedom ended up hampering the ability to satisfy those side constraints. So for example, if science ended up being purified of values so much so that the resulting science just couldn't guide scientific work, So for example, suppose scientists just like completely hedged all of their findings, like maybe such and such is the case, such and such is the case. We did all these measurements on the global climate and we deployed all of these climate models. And is the Earth going to increase in temperature the next 100 years? Maybe, right? So suppose scientists just completely hedged their conclusions so much, policymakers wouldn't know what to do anymore. They wouldn't know, like, should we be trying to deploy like, you know, carbon emission minimizing policies or not? Then, yeah, the pursuit of value freedom would lead to this displacement of priorities. But if the constraints were satisfied, so scientists in particular domains must be producing science which is policy oriented and policy guiding, then I don't think there's this worry about misplaced priorities.
Okay, I don't see any raised hands. Okay, Ashida.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for the talk. So I have a doubt on this pursuit desirability of value freedom. When we talk of pursuit desirability, it is actually asking us to do that. We should try to make science as value freedom as possible, because it is, as an ideal, a complete completely being value free is something undesirable. And I was wondering if undesirability is something not desirable. It means it is not beneficial for some reason for science to be completely value free. That is the inner meaning that I'm getting from that. So I was wondering what or how do we decide what is the safest point of value freedom at which science should stop it?
I think I understood the question. So the question was, what is the point at which we should stop the pursuit of value freedom insofar as complete value freedom is not desirable? And I'm really glad you asked this question, because I suppose what I would want to say is there isn't such a point. Because it's hard to, I mean, once a particular science, I mean, you can only know if you've successfully eliminated a bifurcation point if you've in fact eliminated that bifurcation point. And sometimes the existence of bifurcation points might indeed be opaque to a scientist until some conceptual work is done or some theoretical work is done that then exposes the existence of a bias or a bifurcation point. So one example that I kind of brushed over this, I could have dwelled on it a bit more. It's the example of random allocation of subjects to experimental groups. So here, the interesting methodological development was by this statistician, Fisher, who first had to sort of conceptually discover the very worry, the very bias in the first place, the possibility that different experimental populations could be different with respect to causal factors that could interfere with testing the causal impacts of some experimental intervention. And so he discovered that bias, and then he discovered the tactic of random allocation to try to minimize the threat of that bias. And that was all, I mean, it was hard to even identify the existence of this bias prior to Fisher's work. And that was, you know, like a historical contingency. So I guess what I would want to say is scientists will never know if they're in that kind of like pre-Fisher discovery stage or post-Fisher discovery stage. The awareness of existing biases is something that that occurs contingently and as a result of various sorts of technological developments and conceptual developments. And so if that's true, then there is not a time at which scientists can just say like, right, we achieved the minimal value set. Going any further is going to take us too far towards value freedom. So we're just going to stop here. I don't think that scientists would ever be in that situation. As long as, again, to come back to this satisfying side constraints issue, as long as they were doing work which was action guiding and working within the constraints of ethics and financial limitations and so on. So the scientists are working within those kinds of constraints, then there are going to be existing bifurcation points. And so our dictum applies. The scientists should try to be eliminating them. And that will lead to, another nice thing about our view is that if scientists in fact, and I think they often do, but if they in fact were aiming at satisfying our ideal, then that would motivate new scientific innovations. It would motivate sort of new Fisher type stories, like conceptual and methodological innovations that improve scientific work. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, don't think there are, since there are no more raised hands, let me seek a clarification. I like the distinction, first and foremost, because I also like positivist. But we listened to Stevens recently and the illogical logic of science, where he also seemed to, without using this kind of distinction, seemed to suggest that let's grant scientists the freedom to do whatever they want. The only constraint we are asking them to, or forcing upon them, is that, not us forcing, but the only constraint out there is that they should allow their theories to the tribunal of publicly acceptable empirical evidence. So accept that everything is possible. So here you are also seem to suggest something closer. You aspire for the ideal, value neutral. In between, you can, while striving for that, people, I think you are presuming that people would constrain themselves. Given the empirical constraints already out there, the scientists would constrain themselves if they pursue this value-free idea. Is this what's going on?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure I understood the question. Is the question, who is the agent or institution who should be enforcing the satisfaction of our ideal? Who is that the question? Is who should be involved in identifying?
Yeah. One way to understand it is, I was asking slightly different. Who is one way to go for it? I was asking it in the following way. So you are asking the scientists to look for the value-free end, even though we don't get it. And your reason is that by looking for that, given the already the constraints over them, the policy constraints, ethical constraints, if they strive for this end, they themselves will discover, less like Fisher's case, will discover the biases and they will eliminate it. So in other way, therefore, you are giving a dynamical picture where historically scientists themselves would eliminate kind of biases. But is this the picture you are putting forward?
Yeah. Thanks for that. So, right. I'm kind of.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. So I'm kind of speaking for myself here. I'm not sure what my co-author would say about this, but I think on this question, yeah, there's sort of a Popperian spirit to this notion of exposing bifurcation points. And in fact, Longino herself adopts something like this in her theorizing about scientific criticism. So Longino, I mean, like scientific criticism is just a core feature of Longino's theory. And I think that there's something persuasive about it. So scientists should be critical, about their own work, but be critical in the kind of community in which they're engaged in, and should be responsive to criticisms. And there should be, venues established to promote this critical exchange. And in some sense, very broadly construed, that's all, Popperian in spirit. Our, yeah, like the sort of Fisher sort of story, I think suggests that that critical attitude can lead to developments in conceptual side of science and in methodological aspects of scientific work. And I mean, there's a lot that could be said about, should it be, individual scientists who are acting in this Popperian kind of way? Should there be sort of institutions that are kind of rejigged to facilitate this kind of criticism? How should the elimination of bifurcation points be promoted? There's lots and lots that could be said about all of that. Does that get at your question, Shinat?
Yeah, yes, certainly. Thank you. We have another question. Abhishek?
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you for that, totally wonderful. I was thinking about the motivation that scientists might have to act when they encounter such bifurcation points. Now, in your account, it seems that scientists, or we rather want scientists, that they act as if science should be like value free. So they should act as if like they want the bifurcation point to go away. But at the same time, you also set out that you don't want to reach there. So scientists also do not know at the outset whether this bifurcation point is the one that should be avoided. So I'm wondering about the motivation that scientists really have at that point. Because on one hand, your account says that they should act as if they should remove it. But on the other, they don't really know at the outset whether they should remove that particular point. So maybe you could tell
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. I like it. So maybe I should have been clear on this point. I mean, there are going to be some bifurcation points for which it's clear that they ought to be eliminated. The point is just to eliminate all bifurcation points, as long as the elimination of that bifurcation point doesn't thereby violate one of the operative constraints, like policy guidance, for example. So that's the short answer. Is however the bifurcation points are identified, if one is identified, and a scientist can say, right, we can eliminate that bifurcation point by deploying such and such methodology, or by gathering such and such evidence, or by hedging our conclusions in such and such a way. And we can do one or all of those strategies while still maintaining our, satisfying our ethical constraints, financial constraints, and policy guiding constraints. Then we ought to eliminate that bifurcation point, and there's no ambiguity about it. Of course, there will be ambiguity in lots of hard cases where there is some identification of a bifurcation point, and the elimination of that bifurcation point might end up violating one of the side constraints, and there's going to be hard cases, but there's also going to be lots of easy cases. Thanks, Amish.
So it's more like sort of in a naturalistic spirit that the scientists will really know what to do when they actually encounter such a problem.
I mean, maybe I guess I would phrase it sort of contingently, like sometimes scientists will know, sometimes, like with the Fisher example, for example, they might not know for a long time that there's even this existing bias in the first place, and then there just has to be this kind of methodological development. But maybe and then the kind of Longino point applies, like sometimes some community of scientists won't know that there's an existing bias or an existing bifurcation point until there's this influx of a diverse set of practitioners, and then that will serve to expose the existing biases and existing bifurcation points. And then work can be done to eliminate them. So I wouldn't want to say that bifurcation points are always sort of transparently obvious to scientists. Sometimes they might be, sometimes they might not be. And indeed, like when one reads, like, for example, Twitter feeds or blog posts of scientists who are like speaking about each other's work, you see this kind of mode of criticism like really often, right? You see this a lot, for example, in COVID science. Yeah, that kind of Longino spirit of criticism is actively at play in a lot of scientific work, and that can serve to expose existing bifurcation points. Well, now what to do about them sometimes it's not always so clear, but sometimes it's clear. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, Tushar.
Yeah, so this, came up in our discussion with Tarun today, that most of the accounts of, value neutrality somehow exclude philosophy of physics or physics. Is that the case? Most of the accounts are at the level of policy implementation or at the level of, application, but not at the level of conception of, research nitty-gritty, and especially in the case of physics. So why is it that philosophers of science have excluded the domain of physics? It is due to some inherent reason, or there is some systemic bias for it? What do you think?
Can you repeat the question? So what is it that's being excluded? I didn't quite catch that.
The physics, the findings of physics have been excluded from the value debate. It is always either the biological sciences or the application of the findings. Why do you think is the case?
Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. So if I understood the question correctly, it's that the values in science literature focuses on some scientific domains and not others. The scientific domains in question are often these like policy-oriented domains like medical science, toxicology, climate change, and so on, rather than like high energy physics or like astrophysics. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think part of it is just like the logic of the arguments themselves. So if we think back to the key arguments against the value-free ideal, the way Tarun and I are articulating them, it's the framing problem and the methodological critique. Well, the framing problem is about like some concepts in science are just inherently value laden. And I use the example of poverty. But I mean, is the example of like mass or time value laden in that way? Plausibly not. Or to take the methodological critique. So this argument from inductive risk, the idea is like science, we can be in error, and if the error has practical consequences, then awareness of those consequences can lead us to tune our methods in such and such a way. Well, if our errors don't have any practical consequences, then that methodological critique doesn't apply. I mean, if string theory version 12 is false, but you promote string theory version 12, it's a bit hard to see who's going to be hurt by that. Of course, there are intellectual worries. So that's the kind of simple answer to your question, is the literature on values in science has focused on these, practically oriented sciences. Now, I have come across a few papers which try to say that actually the challenges to the value-free ideal are not domain limited in that way, in part because one practical risk of error in any scientific domain is the direction of future research. So, if string theory version 12 is false, but you promote it and then you get funding for it and you put your grad students on it and your government gives you $10 billion to pursue it, well, that's all. If it's all wasted resources, then that's a practical error. That's a practical consequence. And so the inductive risk argument applies. That's the defense of the domain generality of the challenges to the value-free ideal. I mean, there's something to be said for that argument, but I do agree with the spirit of your question, which is basically like the values in science literature indeed is focused on these policy-oriented sciences like medicine and climate science, and that's because both the framing problem and the methodological critique are most forceful in those sciences where the concepts are value-laden and the errors have like these immediately obvious practical consequences.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tushar. Okay, we have almost exhausted our time. Just 1 more minute left in the scheduled time. So let me take this opportunity to thank Stegenga. This is the second time he's joining with Philsa India. He has given us a lecture in our lecture series earlier. So thanks a lot, both of you, to Tarun as well as Stegenga for developing this framework as well as presenting it to us. So with that, we come to the conclusion of our workshop for the 5-day series. So thank you all for being with us here, and especially
thank you,
for yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. And I should say, yeah, this is the second time. So third one is in person, yeah?
I hope so.
Okay,
yes.
Good deal. Good.
Good.
Thank you all.
All right, that means our sessions are coming to a close tonight for us here. We will meet you, the participants, with your presentations next week. So till then, so bye-bye. And you are free to contact any of us, though Mike didn't give us a presentation during the sessions, but he'll be happy to engage with you over emails. Almost all of our emails are available on the Philsa India website that we have prepared for the workshop. So if you need any that kind of help, feel free to use it. Okay, then, bye. Good night, everybody.